Well, welcome everyone. We're almost at the end of what I have found to be a very stimulating series of conversations about the future of education anchored in this report, Reimagining Our Futures Together. And today we're going to talk about what is the knowledge base that should inform the process of invention, of reimagining, of redesign of education. And so on the first plenary, when we began this forum, I outlined for you the basic framework of the report, the three sections in which it was structured. And the last section talked about the four catalytic actions that would help unleash that reimagining of pedagogy, of curriculum, of the teaching profession, the organization of schools, and the articulation of an education ecosystem. And those actions were, number one, democratic dialogue, participatory dialogue. Number two, more innovation and more knowledge to stimulate that innovation. And then the other two catalytic actions were greater engagement of the university with the rest of the education system and reimagining international cooperation. So today we're going to talk about that element of invention, new design, new knowledge, what knowledge, produce, how, and by whom, and so on. So the way we're going to structure our conversation this afternoon is in two sections. First, I'm going to hear from three experts on three different questions that speak to the topic of the panel. And then together, we're going to explore how we approach knowledge, research, and innovation in a way that reflects diverse ways of knowing, of living, and being for just and sustainable futures. Our International Commission put a lot of emphasis on research from within the education system, on research that also engage as creators of that knowledge, students and teachers and communities. And so we want to bring that aspect of the report into our discussions today. Now, a futures-oriented research agenda also has to look at how these challenges that are discussed in the first part of the report, the challenge of climate change, democratic backsliding, the challenges, the erosion in support for human rights, poverty and inequality, how those challenges intersect with education. And so we need research that allows for different perspectives on the implications of those future scenarios for education. And lastly, we need to continue to think about ways to find creative and effective ways to connect the generation of knowledge, research, with policy and with practice. And so how do we imagine a research agenda that is designed to help improve policy and practice? So to summarize, our three speakers today are going to reflect on what we mean by knowledge, how do we create that knowledge, what is the research that produces that, and how do we mobilize that research to help improve policy and practice. So let me welcome now our three speakers. I'm going to introduce them as I ask them their questions so that you keep in mind their bios as they're answering. In the first, I'm sorry, our three speakers are beginning with the person to my left, Arathi Sripakasha. I'm going to introduce her briefly, then Ebrima Sall, and then Muriel Poisson. But I'm going to introduce them in a second. So in the first part of the panel, they will each take one question, and then I'm going to ask you what additional questions do you have for our speakers. And we're going to ask you, we hope that you have some devices, and we hope you're going to look at a code that we should be projecting right now on the screen, and you're going to see the instructions for how we're going to capture your questions. Basically, you're going to be able to nominate questions and then vote on the questions that have been nominated so that our speakers can address the questions of greater interest. So, can we see the PPT with instructions, please? Are we seeing it? Oh, I'm not seeing it. Oh, there you go. All right, good. Oh, and there's the QR code. Can you all see the QR code? Can you wave your hand if you see the platform? Great, so it's working. Fabulous. Okay, well, let's get going. Keep that platform open because you're able to submit a question even as you hear the speakers address the question that I'm going to pose for them, and then you can vote on those. So my first question is going to be for Arathi. Arathi Tripakesh is a professor of sociology and education at the University of Oxford, and she's currently the president of the British Association for International and Comparative Education. Her research explores racial justice in education, especially the idea of reparation and reparative redress in and through education. She's the lead author of the report Learning with the Past, Racism, Education and Reparative Futures, which was one of the background reports written for UNESCO's Futures of Education Commission. So here's a question for you, Arathi. How can the idea of a new social contract for education inspire different ways of doing research and of mobilizing knowledge?
Thank you, Fernando. Thanks, everybody. The Futures of Education report recognizes that research can catalyze a new social contract for education. So I wanted to share with you a research approach, which I'm calling Reparative Futures of Education, which has really taken inspiration from the ideas set out in the report. So reparative futures of education. Well, a reparative framework is really centered around this idea that the past, present, and future are interconnected. For example, injustices from the past continue in different forms today. We can think about the legacies of colonialism, the structures of racism, and so on. And these injustices will continue into the future in different ways until or unless they are addressed and repaired. So a new social contract requires us to generate knowledge and understanding of how to grapple with past and present injustices in order to reconstruct and repair. So this is a research agenda that needs to be action-oriented. In this sense, a reparative framework is futures-oriented too, because it's trying to create something different. So this has a really important role for research and knowledge generation. It inspires research that is oriented towards redress and repair. Of course, these are all nice ideas to share in the abstract, but what might these look like in practice? What kind of methodologies might this involve? Very briefly, I want to share with you a program of research called Reparative Futures of Education. I won't be able to go into details, but there's a QR code on the slide that you can explore. It's a project that is seeking to explore and create forms of redress for the long histories of racial and class injustices in schooling and society in the specific context of Bristol in England. Now, I want to tell you a bit about the methodological features of this program. First is that it is steeped in partnerships with schools across the city. Secondly, it takes a deliberately and thoughtfully participatory approach, bringing together students, teachers, parents, and the wider community. It sees these participants as knowledge holders. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the research itself is committed to creating dialogic forums. This means the research is not just about extractive data collection, but using the research process to build forums for new collective recognition of the past and present injustices in order to inspire dialogue of what we can do together to make a just future for education. Now, all of these methods are to support the core question of the project, which, as you see, is inspired by UNESCO's Futures of Education report, because the core question is, how should we reimagine schooling for social justice? Reimagine. It's a key word that I'll come back to. So just to say, we've all received a copy of the report, and I encourage you to have a look at the chapter on mobilizing knowledge and research. In it, I want to highlight, in the Reparative Futures of Education project, I want to highlight that we're trying to connect with the core principles, two core principles of the report. The first is the idea of strengthening complex ecologies of knowledges. And this is why we're committed to participatory work and seeing all stakeholders in education as knowledge holders. There's a principle of epistemic justice that sits behind this approach. And secondly, this commitment to transforming research partnerships. This is a principle that we've heard throughout the conference over the last 3 days of nothing about us without us. So I want to end with 2 points before we move on. So the first is that participation and dialogue are vital for creating a new social contract. And indeed, this must be a responsibility for social and academic research, to research not just on communities or not to necessarily just to be extracting data from communities, but using the research methods itself to create the kinds of dialogues that we know are necessary to reimagine a social contract. And secondly, the second idea is that the future is not predetermined. Therefore, we need to mobilize knowledge and research in ways that do not foreclose alternative futures of education. That's precisely why working across diverse stakeholders and constituents is really important. In some ways, people have talked about this as a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. In terms of research and knowledge mobilization, this means that we have to have a commitment to open and imaginative inquiry. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can pick up some of these themes in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Arathi, for that clear and very provocative set of ideas of how to do research in a way that ends up animating a dialogue that transforms communities, that empowers communities to imagine a different future. I know that you probably have already posted some questions, which you can see on the screen of the device you're using, and know that you can vote on the questions. And what you will see is that as you vote on them, the questions that receive the greatest votes will go to the top. Those are the questions that after we hear from the three speakers, we're going to focus our attention on. So feel free to start to vote. So let me now turn it over to Ebrima. And Ebrima Sall is the executive director of TrustAfrica, which is a Pan-African foundation and think tank. Before taking that role, he was the executive secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, which is Africa's leading social science council. He's a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UNESCO Management of Social Transformations program. So, Ebrima, considering the first part of the report talks about these larger trends that call for rethinking the purpose of education, climate change, democratic backsliding, persistent poverty and inequality, erosion of human rights, the uncertainties created by the rise of AI. Considering those trends, what kind of research needs to be strengthened or expanded to inform a future-oriented research agenda for education?
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. I think there's an abundance of research that already, exists out there, and the futures report on futures does a very good job of going through the whole research and showing how complex it is, how uneven it is also, the challenges of that the research is bringing out. It also shows that there are different ways of imagining the future itself. Okay, so I think the question that what we should bear in mind in trying to respond to this question is what kind of future are we aiming at building? And we know that that's also a whole area of investigation because people have different views of what that future is, different kinds of aspirations, depending on where they're sitting. Okay, and so, and in the whole process, we want the people to be part of that creation of the future, foregrounding human agency and strengthening human agency in the search for the future that we want to build and in the building of that future. So I asked myself, if you were to develop a program for the observatory that UNESCO wants to build, Futures of Education Observatory, what would be the agenda? So in a sense, I think that's the kind of question we should be asking ourselves. And so in answering that question, I have proposed 5 points or 6 points. I will try to make them very quickly. The first one is to think about the mega trends that have been highlighted by the keynote speaker of the first day, Tracy Bonds, and all the other speakers. They include demography, climate, urbanization, big tech, changing world of work, and so on. Now, there are points of consensus around each one of those mega trends, but there are also contestations. Not because people are doubting the existence. Of course, there are some denials until now, but it's because there are differences in terms of the impact that these trends are having in different parts of the world. And the responses also are not the same. And then the capacity to respond are not the same. And because of the power issues involved. So there's a whole area in which we need to pay attention. And there are regional variations. You take climate change, for example. The way, who has contributed most for it, how it is impacting on different parts of the world, who has the capacity to respond, where are the resources coming from, a whole set of issues. And similarly, if you take the demographic problem that has been referred to as also in the presentations, the world is predominantly young, and it is becoming more and more comprised of younger people. And in that whole situation, we know that most of these young people are actually in Asia and Africa today. And in the next 30 or 40 years or so, most of those people will be in Africa. Now, what does that mean for education? What does that mean for the future of education? What kind of infrastructure requirements are there? So there's a whole set of investigations that need to be carried out by research on those issues as well. And how is education taking into account those facts, those big trends, and how is it responding to those trends? So the observatory would then have to monitor those trends and find ways of responding to them. The second issue I want to highlight is the other of inequality, which is central in many of these things we are talking about. We live in an unequal world, and the inequalities are everywhere. In terms of the way the problems are playing out, the inequalities also exist in the responses and on the impact of the problems. Most recent illustration of this is the COVID pandemic, which impacted on everybody, the rich and the poor in all regions of the world. But we also saw how, in trying to address the problem of the pandemic, some old reflexes came back. The tendency to prioritize one's own issues, one's own country's interests, and what has been called vaccine nationalism and so on came up. So we do have things that we have to pay attention to very carefully. More important is the inequalities can be reproduced in responses we are trying to find to the problems of the world, including problems of climate. The green solutions, have an impact in some instances that are devastating on the economies of some countries. So we might be reproducing dependence or creating new dependencies and creating new kinds of inequalities. And that has also a great importance for education, and the observatory should pay attention to that. The third thing I want to say is, now, talking about knowledge itself, and the point has been made already, there are inequalities in the knowledge production world itself, which, for a time, we were talking about a global epistemological order, which is unequal, favoring the North more than the South, and it tends to mirror the global inequalities that exist there, and actually participates in what reproduces those global inequalities. And that we have to bear in mind. Because in the South in particular, and in the global South, which is not only located in the South geographically, it's it's a political concept that sort of speaks to all the subaltern groups wherever they are in the North and in the South. Inequalities are there, and the way they perceive the problems, the way they understand them is completely different, and that has to be taken into account when we interrogate. Many of the councils of the South, CLACSO in Latin America, Latin American Council of Sciences, or CODESRIA, where I worked before, or the Subaltern Studies Group in Asia, particularly in India, spent a lot of time questioning what was called the colonial library, the way in which the scientists we are working with actually carry a lot of baggage with them. And I think this is also reflected in the way even the educational institutions are structured and the way they're shaped, the way they're functioning, the way the rankings that are there. The tendency to have most of the highly ranked institutions and journals located in some parts of the world and not everywhere. And so there are a number of issues here which you need to take into account. There are problems with the way in which the intellectual communities also work, and communities themselves which are divided, including in the South, where we have for a long time lived in what has been called a fragmentation. On one hand, we have the Europhone intellectuals and Europhone knowledges right? I'm citing Appiah, Usman and others. And then there are non-Europhone ones who are working with indigenous knowledges, speaking languages that are not the dominant languages. The knowledges they produce tend to be marginalized. Now, all those things we should be taken care of when we are trying to create a future that is good for everyone. The fourth point is the problem of the divides between the knowledge communities themselves, the ecologies of knowledge that are important. It is now recognized that there is great value in adopting an ecosystemic approach to knowledge production itself and to research, and that there is a need to divide the bridges. To bridge the divides. To bridge the divides that exist in the knowledge and in the educational systems as well. And UNESCO published a good report in 2010. The World Social Science Report, UNESCO and the International Social Science Council, which is still good to read and go back to. I want to go to the point about justice that has been raised that Arati spoke to. I think it is maybe the one concept that runs across many of the issues that we are speaking about here. Whether you're looking at it from the point of view of communities or from gender or from the point of view of communities that are discriminated on the basis of work and descent, the issue of justice is very central. It's very, very important. It's about epistemic justice. It's about gender justice. It's about climate justice, economic justice, social justice. It's one concept which I think should be central in the research that we need to be encouraging and we need to be promoting going forward. The final or second to last point I want to speak to is what is happening within the institutions themselves. The schools and the universities can be extremely harsh environments for the people who are working in them or for the people who are studying there or doing research there. Academic freedom, problems of sexual harassment, marginalization of all kinds. And you can't possibly do good research or be productive in an environment that is not conducive. So I think we should take a hard look at the environments where we work, because some of the problems come from us. Older scholars tending to be not so kind to the younger ones, male scholars not being so kind to the female ones, and so on and so forth. So there is something to do. Upholding academic freedom should be part of the ethics and the things that we should be promoting. The final point I want to make is to do with, we're talking about sustainable futures. The issue of sustainability itself needs to be interrogated. 2 years ago, my organization started a program called Reclaim Sustainability, because it is understood that if you take, for example, agricultural value chains, you take the production of cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire to the chocolate that is being sold in the supermarkets of Europe, for example. And now, the differences in terms of who gets what are enormous. The conditions under which people work on the plantations of cocoa are horrible. Children, women, slave-like conditions. So there's a whole set of work and a process that are there. And the argument we are making under that program, the assumption is that for sustainability to be meaningful, whether you're talking about the environment or the sustainability even of the economies and so on, you need to have those who are involved in producing the wealth and the value having a say in how the value is estimated, it is shared, is distributed, the pricing, and so on. So the people, in other words, if you go out of that setup and you look at even farmers more generally or workers, talking about a new wall of work, those who are on the front line, those who are the producers, should be part of the decision-making processes. And that is extremely important because it gives a completely different result and a completely different new world. I want to end by saying that what we need actually to address all these issues is, a few months ago, the global community came together in New York and adopted a pact for the future. Okay? It's interesting that there has been very little reference to that pact since the beginning of this conference and the forum, and I don't know why. But if it is a continuation of this conversation for a long time that has been going on over all these years, and now it's understood that we need to do more than adopting sustainable development goals or something like that. We need a pact where everybody should come together and actually begin understanding that we are together. In all of my big brother here is the minister, Cham. There's a Senegalese philosopher who has written a poem during the time of COVID titled The Song of the Masks. The Song of the Masks. It's a very short paper. And he was citing the reaction of the governor of New York then, who was actually amazed when he was told that masks are not meant to protect those who are wearing them, but those you are interacting with. So he thought that was beautiful. And Bashir from there wrote this paper and said, look, this is what humanity is about. In Wolof, the saying is, the solutions to the problems of human beings are in the hands of other human beings. Okay? And that's what the Southern Africans call Ubuntu. I am because we are together. Okay? And a variant of that saying is that the solutions to the problems of the human being are in nite mogaramam. It's in being a superior form of human being. And it's not being human in terms of some kind of anthropocentrism, but it is humanism that is grounded in an understanding of the interdependence that you have, not only with the humans, but with all inhabitants of the planet. Okay? And that goes back far in the history of Africa. Article 1 of the Mande Charter, which was adopted in present-day Malawi in 1212, before the Magna Carta, has as Article 1 of it, every life is a life. You can find that article in various versions of it on the internet. Every life is a life. And it talks about relations between people and the planet and animals and strangers and so on. So it's very, very important that we reconnect with that past, the good of the past, we repair the injustices that were there, but at the same time, you can take that as a point of departure for imagining a future that will build upon that and take us into new and superior forms of being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ebrima, for helping us think about what a future-oriented research agenda would look like, taking into account regional variations, the changing knowledge economies, this idea of emancipatory imaginations, reclaiming sustainability, and then the topic of tracking inequalities. So let me now turn to Muriel Poisson. Muriel is the team leader for UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning, which I imagine many of you know as the crown jewel of UNESCO. It is an institution that I think took on the task of building a new profession, the profession of educational planning, and that really created an epistemic community of people who share a set of goals of what planning and policy analyses were going to be, especially in the Global South. But since its inception for IIP planning had to be connected to a research base, to a knowledge base. And I remember Thorsten Hussein and Neville Postlewhite, who played a key role in the early years of the Institute. They had big hopes for how research-based knowledge was going to inform planning, but they were also disappointed that so much research was not used by governments. And so this question of research used by policymakers is one that has been with us for a long time, and it's a question that Muriel thinks about and acts upon in her role. She is the team leader of IIP's team on knowledge generation and mobilization, and she coordinates the research, communication, publication, and library functions of the Institute. She's also managing IIP's new research using digital tools to renew planning and management techniques, which is part of her work on transparency in education. So, Muriel, what are some of the ways to strengthen and harness the reflexive capacity of governments to use knowledge and research for policymaking and for planning?
Thanks a lot, Fernando. Good afternoon to all of you. So that's a difficult topic, the one of the use of data, evidence, and research by decision makers, educational planners, and managers. I'm sure that in the room there are many people that are convinced about the importance of it, the way it can help improve the informed dialogues, the way it can help improve transparency and accountability within the education systems. But at the same time, we know that the connection between the two is not that obvious. So to try to structure a little bit our reflections and discussion on that, I wanted to start by sharing with you those 4 main basic principles that you can see on the screen. The first one is the principle of bottom-up research, and I will come back to that, but with the idea that this first principle can be key to help address one of the main criticisms that is made sometimes towards research, is that it doesn't necessarily reflect grassroots realities, nor the most pressing issues that local education actors face, and then at the end of the day is not that useful for informing the decision-making process. So that's the first one. The second principle that I wanted to share with you is that of ownership. Ownership of the research, ownership of data, ownership of evidence by education authorities. Here again, this principle to try to address one of the criticisms that is often made to research is that the research that is available is not that is required to inform decision-making at one specific point in time. And again, I will get back to this one. The third principle that I wanted to share with you is that of capacity building. Again, to address one of the criticisms that sometimes is made towards research is that the research that is produced is not immediately understandable nor usable by policymakers, planners, and managers. And the last principle that I wanted to share with you is that of education governance, because when we are talking about the use of data and evidence to inform policy and planning, obviously this is not coming as part of a vacuum. You need to contextualize what you are talking about. In many contexts, decisions are made based on political considerations only. They are not based sometimes at all on research findings in any ways. And so this overall concept of education governance to take into account is something I think that we should keep in mind. So I'm going to go back very briefly to each of those basic principles, trying to share with you how at IP, indeed, this UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning, we are trying to address them at least partially. So the first one, talking about bottom-up research, well, this echoes what it is framed if you get back to the report of the commissions and the specific chapter that is related to research, and that talks about the importance of inclusive stakeholder engagement in research to ensure context-specific practitioner knowledge is mobilized, that very specific issues related, for instance, to gender or to equity are not overlooked, and that altogether diverse perspectives are duly taken into account. When we bring this back to the field of policymaking, educational planning and management, it can mean, for instance, to make sure that civil society organizations are duly involved in the process of policy and planning cycle, from sectoral diagnosis to the formulations of education sector plans to the monitoring and evaluations of the education sector, and are put in the capacity to share the research that they produce themselves on a diversity of dimensions. So in our case, during the past 2 years at IP, we have been actively working with civil society organizations through the Education Outload Network that maybe some of you knows, that has been supported by the GPE. And we have offered, for instance, an online course on the basics of planning to those civil society organizations, and try also to learn to all what they have to bring in into the policy and planning cycle, including from a research perspective. And then I can mention to you, for instance, that we found very interesting pieces of research that do, in fact, have an influence on the policy and planning cycles in a number of countries. I can just mention a few. There were the examples, for instance, of the Somaliland Network of Education for All, that is a coalition of NGOs that has produced very interesting research on education budget analysis to identify gaps in funding to rural schools, for instance. In the case of Cabo Verde, there were other civil society organizations producing very interesting research on household cost and community cost that are often neglected when we're talking about education financing within the education sector, and that help feed the discussions as part of the formulations of the ESPs. And I can mention many other examples of research in Vietnam related to educations of minority ethnic groups, research by the Papua New Guinea Education and Advocacy Network on people with disabilities and their access to schooling. Very interesting research from the education coalitions of Zimbabwe on learner welfare, paying attention to issues such as teenage pregnancy, child marriage, abuse, violence, mental health, and so on, that really help feed into the sectoral diagnosis and into the formulations of the education sector plans. Of course, it takes time. If you go through this type of process that is bottom-up, you need to have participatory structures. Sometimes you need to pause in the research agenda and the policy formulation agenda. It takes time. It can be costly. This needs to be taken into account. But clearly, that's a very important way to get much closer to what is happening at the points of service delivery of the school level and the teaching learning process. Now, turning to the second principle, which is that of ownership. Well, that's a difficult one, and I'm sure that within the room there may be very different views at it. Building research capacities within the education administrative structure, during the few past years, I think there has been an interesting trend of creating innovation labs, research evidence labs, evidence-embedded labs in a number of ministries of education to try to promote a little bit more the research agenda within ministries and within institutional structures, with the idea that this can be a way to produce the data that is needed by those authorities, to facilitate evidence uptakes, to make the connections with policy, having a clear concern for translating this evidence in a way that can be usable by education authorities. And this is something that we can observe in a number of countries, including, for instance, Peru or the Philippines. Obviously, this cannot be the only source of research and of knowledge. It can also question the autonomy and the independence of the research that is produced this way. At the same time, we believe, again, from the IP side, that it's interesting to see how much these kind of evolutions in terms of ownership of the research in a way can help foster a number of innovations within ministries, and we should have some kind of research and policy review next year to see how we can influence it, especially the work of educational planners. Now, turning to the third principle, which is that of capacity building. We know that there is a clear gap between the availability of data and evidence and its use in policy formulations. Part of it can be lack of capacities from education authorities at all levels of the system, central levels, local level, the middle tier, and down to the school level. More broadly speaking, and beyond capacities, it can be connected also with a number of other factors to be taken into account related to institutional, organizational structures, motivation of staff, learning culture that exists within the public administration. And so one thing that we're also trying to do at IP is to document that. And so we have joined hands with the colleagues from the OECD as part of the FA1 initiative that maybe some of you knows, that is part of the education cooperations mechanisms for SDG 4, to develop some kind of methodology to assess the institutional capacities of education authorities to make use of data and evidence. And so this is something that has been piloted by the colleagues from the OECD in Latvia, that IP is currently piloting at the middle tier in Pakistan, and to learn from this experience, well, to build then the capacities of those authorities at different levels of the system. And then I'm going to finish with the last principle of education governance. Well, bringing it back to my introductions and mentioning that, well, of course, all of this, we don't want all of this to be, well, good species related to bottom-up, ownership, capacity buildings, but to be in the real world. Well, there are a number of elements from the environment that we need to take into account, such as the resistance to use data and evidence, the fact that in most countries the government process still are framed as very technical, data-oriented, top-down process, that obviously there are political and vested interests from all stakeholders, not only government, but also from the civil society side, that we're operating in restricted civic space and even restricting civic space in quite a number of contexts. And well, those are clearly factors that we should not forget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muriel, for sharing with us how IIP uses this four-pillar strategy to help close the gap between research and policy, this what you call bottoms-up, the notion of ownership, the issue of building capacity, and the issue of governance. So I think the three of you, Arathi, Ebrima, and Muriel, have given us fairly complementary perspectives. I hear, for example, a common theme is engage with the very communities of people affected by policy and by practice in formulating what are the questions of interest with an aim at addressing what you call these reparative function, examine these inequalities, these injustices with the goals of helping to repair them, do it with the communities, and so on. So now we're going to take 15 minutes to look at your questions, which I hope are being projected on the screen right now. Can we see the questions? That's one issue that we didn't think about. How was the panel going to be able to read the questions? But I'm hoping that they're being projected here. Yes, they are. And so I'm going to have to stand up so I can read them. And I can see that at the top is a question that is the most popular, 23 votes. So connecting these aspirations might seem overwhelming for schools or systems. From your perspective, what are the top low-cost entry points for visible action? I'm going to read 3 questions and then ask you to maybe pick one, okay? Because they are related. The second one is, what can we do to improve the connection between research and policy? And third question is, how can we address the varying visions of the future of education while countries like the Republic of Korea focus on AI, developing nations are still working on providing quality. So let's turn this over to you. First question is, what's low-hanging fruit? What's the low-cost entry point to do some of what you've been describing? How can we strengthen that connection between research and policy? And how do we address varying visions of the futures in education? And then whoever is controlling these, you can now click on these questions so we can see the next 3. Thank you. Yep, please, Arathi.
Okay, thank you. I will try to respond to the first one about what some of the top so-called low-cost entry points are to visible action. And 2 that come to mind immediately is the power of pedagogy. I think all teachers do have agency in classrooms. Despite sometimes very difficult working conditions, a good teacher really makes a difference, and we know that from the research. Whether this is low cost or not is debatable. Of course, teachers need resources, and time is a resource too. We see in many contexts that teachers' workloads are becoming very difficult. And in fact, they're engaging in what you might call non-educational focused work with a lot of administrative burden and so on. But I do want to hold on to the importance of teachers' work, and that this idea of quality pedagogy must be at the heart of that. And the second aspect, I think, is, and it follows really the focus on dialogue, is schools can do a lot to facilitate community engagement. And a big part of this, and I think a really important part, and I've seen this across the various contexts that I've conducted research in, from India, the UK, Australia, and so on, is that we really need to challenge the deficit framing of marginalised communities. Schools must understand that these communities are themselves resources that they can engage with and learn from. And so I think this doesn't actually, I don't think, this doesn't have a cost. It has a shift in mindset, but I think it's a very powerful one.
Thank you, Arathi. Would any of you want to pick one of the questions there? Yeah.
Yes, I think I'll take the last one and leave the policy one to... I mean, I think how do you deal with situations like what we saw? I was in the group that visited this very impressive school here in Sewun yesterday, where they had an AI lab for primary school. It's a primary school. AI lab, science lab, futuristic. It's almost like we are seeing what everybody would like to see years from now. And for a time, there was a feeling that it was as if people were, emphasizing so much technological part of it, that they forgot the human bit. But when we had a conversation with the teachers, they were very confident that AI will never replace them. The AI will never replace them. So I think where I come from, I don't know who I was talking to, it was you or Tracy, I think. And I was saying, look, we have in our African context, maybe 4 revolutions to make at the same time. Although the concept of industrial revolution itself is being subjected to conversations but let's use it for the convenience of it. There are still problems for access to electricity, access to the internet, serious infrastructure problems. So under conditions like those ones, one could be tempted to think that, well, AI is a luxury. But once we had at Kodesre, we organized a meeting once with the Carnegie Corporation, and the president of the corporation was present at the meeting. And it was on higher education. For many years in Africa, we have been told that Africa doesn't need higher education. What we need is basic education. And because higher education is an expensive luxury that involves only a few people. And what we needed of higher education, it was more cost-effective to send the African students abroad to do it. So that went on for a long time. Fortunately, nobody listened. But the point that this president of Carnegie was making was that, look, when the United States were developing their program of land-grant universities, America was in a war, a civil war then. And they didn't say we are in a war situation, therefore we shouldn't invest in higher education. The point I want to make is we need AI, we need the technologies, we need everything. But we should not let the technologies drive what we are doing. It is in an engagement with the communities and everywhere for us to determine how you bring them in, under what conditions, what do you do so that you don't create new inequalities again, you don't reproduce the inequalities and make them difficult. So it's up to every community and every country and every region to determine actually how you go about it. But I think we need it everywhere. We need the technologies, we need good infrastructure. Nobody wants to go and be lighting candles where you can have electricity or solar panels. Nobody in their right mind would do that. If they're still lighting candles, it's because they cannot afford it. And so I think it's important to do this, and that's my attitude to education. That's how I would address it. And I would end by saying that for the pact of the future to be meaningful, we have to have pacts of the future everywhere at every level that are negotiated on the conditions of the places where we are having the pact, so that we can have the contract, social contract, is not only a global abstract thing, it has to be translated concretely everywhere at every level of the societies. Yeah.
Thank you, Ebrima. Muriel, maybe the question on closing the relationship between research and policy.
So yeah, maybe picking this one. Well, if you look at it from the international perspective and the role that an institution such as IP, for instance, can play in these domains, maybe we can have 2 answers to this one. 3 weeks ago, we organized at IP a big regional conference in Asia-Pacific on the future of educational planning for Asia-Pacific, and we had some discussions about the role of research in this one. Well, there were some discussions on different very important topics that should be given more attention in the domain, such as planning in small island states, talking about Pacific countries, about the impact of climate change, of planning, on the digitalization and the impacts for planning and so on. But at the same time, the participants told you there is already so much a wealth of research, a wealth of studies that exist, a wealth of data and evidence that maybe where you can play the most critical role is to create repositories that are easily accessible, including by decision makers and trying to help with the translation of all of this existing work in a way that is communicatable, I don't know if you can say that in English, to decision makers and planners. So this is also one of the things that we would like to do from 2025, which is to develop an observatory related to educational planning and management, where this wealth of research that is of particular interest, especially for planners, can be easily used. Of course, that's not new. There are existing repositories, including in our institutions for years, but making the connections also with all of those discussions that we have had during those past 3 days on the role of digitalizations. Those new digital tools now allow us to facilitate the exploitations, the analysis, and the communications of some of the informations and results that exist within those different studies and research, using chatbots, using natural language processing and so on. And maybe that's a way to help, very partial, but making the connections between research and policy. Yeah.
Thank you, Muriel. I think we have time for another round of 3 questions. Let's see, beginning at the top. So what solutions can address online learning challenges during COVID-19? I'm trying to understand the connection between this and the question of the panel, which is the research agenda. So maybe we can put a spin on that, on how could we study, how could research help find solutions to address the learning challenges. The second question is, how can nations work with existing internationally schools, historically colonially founded, to better serve a more migratory workforce with equity? Again, I imagine the question for this panel is, how could research help answer this question? What kind of research could help us answer this question? And the third one is, learning and using digital technology is limited due to differences in access and capacity. And then, I guess, how can research help us figure out how to overcome inequality? So I'm going to invite you each, maybe in no more than 2 minutes, address any of these questions that you want. Arathi, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you. I'm going to make some connections to the question about international schools, just to say that, we do talk about inequality and marginalized communities a lot in these forums, and rightly so. But of course, we have to understand the relationality of inequality, that the dispossession of some is linked to the accumulation of advantages to others. And so one of the principles of the reparative education approach is actually to work across all communities. So in our project, we're working in state schools, including in very deprived parts of the city, as well as very privileged private schools. And so I just wanted to make that point, that a new social contract requires that cross-cutting participation and dialogue. And so I think I just wanted to speak to that sort of principle that might help us understand what might be lying behind that question. And the last question on the slide is about how do we make social contracts considering all people, and is it possible to make this universal? And I think this really speaks to your point that we have to work out what this means in practice. And I think I think the social contract ought to be, and as indeed the report urges us to consider, how this must be underpinned by the values of human rights, absolutely, and how this gets worked out within communities with specific histories of inequality and injustice must be worked out in dialogue, in participation. So this is the kind of research agenda that I was sharing that offers a very grounded approach.
Just to build upon what Arathi just said, we now say, and we accept willingly, that there are knowledges, there are experiences, there are, people know skills that exist already. Often the research community will approach that and take them as objects of research. We study them, We don't engage them as legitimate partners in the search to understand how to work things out. I think it's the same principle you should adopt win in terms of research, knowledge, indigenous knowledges that exist, the communities we work with. If the point of departure is to say, hey, look, we are bringing things to people, we are going to help, we are going to, that doesn't work. Usually, that has what has been actually keeping us where we are until now. We just have to recognize once that there is agency, there is knowledge, there is, there are experiences in everything, and then engage from that point of view. Now, maybe just one thing about COVID, the point about COVID and learning. You see, we say that COVID took everybody by surprise, but some were better prepared than others, okay? The infrastructure existed, the laboratories existed, they could manufacture vaccines over a short period of time or import them from somewhere. Elsewhere, it was more serious. When you have a rickety health system that is under-resourced, people are not prepared, the impact was potentially more devastating. And in responding to COVID, we saw it happen. It took a long time before you had something like COVAX, this program where countries put a lot of resources together to make vaccines and, first of all, PPEs, the protective equipment available, and then vaccines. But these were supplied. Even when they began assembling them in the South, everything would be manufactured somewhere, and then you just put them, package them in the countries where they were supposed to be manufactured. Now, that is what should change. I think every country, every part of the world, we should aim at making sure that capacities are enhanced and infrastructure is there, and that health that was neglected. In Africa, the African Union adopted a principle, I think it was in 2010, to say that they would spend 10% of national budgets on health every year. 10 years later on, not even 5 countries were doing it. So that is the kind of thing we should change. I think people should prepare and be more anticipatory in the way we address these issues. And again, in that process, COVID has demonstrated that being selfish doesn't help, because you are not safe so long as everybody is not safe. It brings us back again to what we were saying about solidarity. And in this process, I think, and I learned on that point, collaborations are important for transformation. But we want transformative collaborations. We want transformative research collaborations. And I think that's what the observatory, when it is set up, should encourage. Transformative research collaborations everywhere.
Maybe also to react very briefly also on the COVID and how research can help us maybe draw all the lessons that we need from this period that has been particularly severe, including in this region. I think there is a new generation of research that is currently being produced on the impact of COVID on the well-being, on social-emotional skills, on the mental health, not only of the pupils, but also of the teachers, that are very interesting. And that encourages, for instance, to look at new sets of data and try to see how this can be monitored within the systems, how this can be taken into account as part of the diagnosis also of the sector, how to better formulate a number of policies that also include and pay attention to these types of issues. And so certainly there is much more to be done in future years to be in a better positions to prepare to this type of disruptions.
Well, thank you very much, Arathi, Ebrima, and Muriel, for your thoughts on how it is that the generation of knowledge can animate a transformative agenda of education in terms of the questions that are pursued, in terms of the approaches that are used, these research community partnerships, research public partnerships, in terms of the ways in which the research is conducted. But I think the important thing that I take away is how important specialized to inform this agenda of invention, of reimagining of education. So please join me in giving our 3 panelists thank you. And with that, we turn it over to the next.